Hello and welcome to the 13th Annual Kosciuszko Chair Spring Symposium. This year's virtual conference will focus on the topic of crisis in the Intermarium, war in Ukraine and its implications. Today's joint virtual symposium is organized by the Institute of World Politics and is in honor of Lady Blanka Rosenstiel. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs. We offer a doctoral program, 7 master's degree programs, including 2 online MAs, and 18 certificates of graduate study. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. On behalf of IWP, I'd like to thank all our supporters who make these events possible. Today we will hear from Dr. Marek Chodakiewicz, who will give a lecture entitled Endgame in Ukraine. Dr. Chodakiewicz is a professor of history at IWP, where he holds the Kosciuszko Chair of Polish Studies. He also leads IWP's Center for Intermarium Studies. He has authored numerous works in English and Polish, including Intermarium, the land between the Black and Baltic Seas. In addition, Dr. Chodakiewicz has authored several articles and columns on foreign policy and politics in the Journal of World Affairs, American Spectator, and Crisis magazine. His interests include the post-Soviet zone, the Second World War and its aftermath, Europe in the 19th and 20th century, Western civilization and its intellectual tradition, extremist movements in history, conspiracy theory in practice, and comparative civilizations. At IWP, Dr. Chodakiewicz teaches courses on contemporary politics and diplomacy, geography and strategy, mass murder prevention in failed and failing states, and Russian politics and foreign policy. In addition, he leads directed studies. Please welcome Dr. Chodakiewicz.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute of World Politics. Today, I would like to consider a possible endgame in Ukraine. There are several possible outcomes of the current war in Ukraine, and I would like to discuss them. Please bear with me because some of what I have to say sounds like a horror story, and some like horror story combined with fantasy. We will be looking at the crystal ball. So once again, nothing is said. I'm just letting my geopolitical imagination run wild. And nothing is off limits. We should really look at every possibility. So, as I understand the situation, rather than clearly clean cut, the outcomes can bear a variety of iterations. We can expect a certain degree of ambiguity to persist after the conclusion of the war, including a frozen conflict of various degrees. Sadly, a complete and permanent solution may remain quite elusive for a long time to come. Nonetheless, it's our responsibility to consider all sorts of scenarios, including those bordering on fantasy or horror. First, there can be a victory of either side. Second, there can be a triumph for neither, a stalemate. Ultimately, however, the outcome will depend on the involvement by third parties of its luck. And that, in turn, will inform whether the conflict will metastasize and to what extent. So here is a dream scenario maximum. Russia loses, plain and simple. The Russian army collapses. The unrest spreads inside the Russian Federation. Putin is overthrown. Russia implodes into its component parts where all minorities proclaim independence. Russia is thus reduced to the area of the medieval Muscovite state. This would be a case for celebration for all victims of Russian terror and imperialism over the centuries, except from the geopolitical view of the West. Because the West needs Russia as a barrier against China, as imagined by Sir Halford Mackinder in his geographic pivot of history idea. He argued that whoever controlled the geographic pivot of history, which currently, in his times, it was the Russian Empire, but currently it's Western Kazakhstan, a Southern Russian Federation, and Eastern Ukraine. Whoever controls it prevents chaos, prevents barbarians from streaming into Europe. If there is no control, we have anarchy, we have chaos. That's why grudgingly many agree to Russia's control, because they believe in this scheme and they believe Russia has a role. So a dream scenario maximum has a caveat. If Russia collapses, China moves in. And most in the West do not want that. Also, let's look at a dream scenario minimum. Russian forces collapse on the Ukrainian front, Putin is overthrown, and there emerges long-time chaos, smuta, or a hardcore successor regime which continues the war immediately or after a spell, or a liberal pro-Western government which is a rosy-eyed near impossibility in Moscow. But miracles do happen. And then let's look at another scenario. Because of continued Western assistance, Russia stumbles, Ukraine recoups some of its land, and the conflict freezes. Initially low-level fighting and a war of attrition continue, and then there is a gradual freeze only to be punctuated by cyclical flare-ups, a new phase of neither war nor peace. Moscow will try again at a more opportune time. That, of course, is predicated upon Russia remaining stable. So again, we should supply a footnote here, which goes both to a dream scenario minimum and to a frozen conflict without Russia's collapse. Almost immediately after invading Ukraine a few years ago, and even before to some extent, the Russians started fortifying their border. Now, given that Kiev really has no capacity for a long-term offensive war, an invasion of Russia, and occupation of Moscow, it made me think why the Russians equipped their border so. It wasn't because of commando and guerrilla penetrations, although they do happen from the Ukrainian side, including the Russian emigre legion. It's because Moscow wanted to prevent the repetition of the First World War, when deserters from the Russian Imperial Army started streaming home. So in the good old Stalinist fashion, Putin blocked the access for his own troops to return to the home country. Of course, when we had the bizarre incident with the Wagner rebellion, it didn't help. They just streamed back home. Of course, the rebellion could have been defeated, nipped in the bud right away, but for some reason, the Russian Air Force decided not to do it, whether it was the Kremlin's decision or an expression of ineptitude or expression of dissent towards the Kremlin. We shall find out when the archives are open. So there is this possibility of the army rebelling, Russian army rebelling and marching, a distant possibility, and marching on Moscow, the whole army. But still, when the army captures, if it captures Moscow and overthrows Putin, then what? The Russians, for the most part, find Putin palatable and more. The Russians believe in their imperial mission, and there is no empire without Ukraine. So Ukraine must be crushed, must be subjugated in a variety of ways. Okay, so let's move to a nightmare scenario maximum. This was, I discussed Russia's, I've just discussed Russia's collapse, partial or full, in a variety of ways. So we had a dream scenario maximum, now a nightmare scenario maximum. Russia surges, Ukraine collapses, and the Red Army continues into Europe. NATO's eastern flank, the Baltics, Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria fall. Moscow restores its empire and pushes westward to dominate Western Europe. The US and its allies rebound and counterattack. China then joins the fray on Russia's side. The Third World War ensues with all it entails, including nuclear annihilation. Other nations flock to either side or try to remain neutral and see what happens. That would be a nightmare scenario maximum, the Third World War, growing out of the war in Ukraine. A nightmare scenario medium is, globally speaking, a little less scary, but it's still horrible. So after the loss of the Intermarium, the lands between the Black, Baltic, and Adriatic seas to Russia, the West calls it quits. Detente with the Kremlin ensues, compromised by its failure to defend Central and Eastern Europe and shaken in its leadership. The US pulls out of Europe, which becomes a condominium of Moscow and Berlin, which disguises itself as a rump European Union. The US goes full-fledged isolationist with a soft spot for a special relationship with the United Kingdom. China bides its time, waiting to step in to claim its global dominance. Why? Because everyone will be first bleeding and then devoting its resources to the European theater. A nightmare scenario minimum is Ukraine falls to Russia. The border of the old Warsaw Pact becomes a zone of a frozen conflict. A new Iron Curtain falls. Periodically, Russia continues its imperial expansion. First goes Kazakhstan, then the other stans. Meanwhile, Moscow also probes westward. It takes the Baltics, and it finds itself on the Polish border. And here is a fantasy scenario, I kid you not, promoted by Russia. how do we solve the war in Ukraine? And the Russians approached the liberal Polish government, the civic platform government, already about it some 15 years ago or so. So how do we solve the problem of Ukraine? Well, Moscow says, let Poland join Russia in partitioning Ukraine. Let Hungary hop on the bandwagon. This is the least likely scenario, in particular for Warsaw. Budapest will not move on its own. Its current government is too prudent, too Bismarckian. Someone has told me that Budapest acts the way that Berlin wishes it could. The fantasy scenario concocted by Russia is in a way projection of Moscow's own attitudes. Namely, Putin is convinced, and he even said so in the interview with Tucker Carlson, which Carlson, of course, didn't understand, that Russia must dominate. And he understands Poland to be the aggressor as well, and to harbor imperial dreams, because once it was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that dominated the lands between the Black and Baltic Seas. So the best way to solve the Ukrainian problem is to dump Western Ukraine onto Poland. Why? Well, Western Ukrainians are the most nationally conscious of all Ukraine. Also, they, or at least their nationalist leaders, are known for their unmitigated hatred of the Poles. They are absolutely unapologetic in their eulogizing of the genocide of the Polish people by Ukrainian nationalist forces during the Second World War. I mean, the Poles are not even allowed to bury their dead properly. And Ukrainian nationalists are completely in denial. On the one hand, they are happy that the genocide and ethnic cleansing happened. And on the other hand, they deny it ever happened. So the question is as follows. If the Jewish people are gone, that's because of the Holocaust. And why are the Polish people gone? Because many were slaughtered, about 120,000, between more or less 1939 and 1945. And the rest were expelled by Stalin, thus making Ukrainian ethno-nationalist fantasy of purity come true. So Moscow banks on the resentments that exist, historical memories of the families of the Polish expellees and of those countless murdered by the Ukrainian nationalists, on the one hand, and on the other hand, ham-fisted approach of the Kievan government, which eulogizes and apologizes for the crimes of Ukrainian integral nationalists, the Ukrainian insurgent army, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Thus making this situation untenable in the long term. Why? Poland has been arguably the best ally for Ukraine. Not only over 9 million Ukrainians have crossed the Polish border, to seek refuge temporarily or permanently. Not only were they welcomed, but Poland effectively disarmed itself, turning over most of its armor and lots of armaments, which the previous government of Law and Justice did, to help Ukraine. To an extent, this was dictated by the fear of Russian victory and its consequences. But to another extent, this was dictated by romanticism about Ukraine. This romanticism in Poland in no way translates itself in any imperialist designs on Ukraine or Belarus or Lithuania. Such fantasies may be harbored among a fringe, but they absolutely do not play any role in the mainstream. Yet, Moscow, Putin, hopes that this historical memory, which is unresolved, mostly because of the choice that Ukraine makes, can be somehow translated into fulfilling this fantasy scenario, which would allow Russia to dominate Ukraine and throw Poland a bone. I cannot think of a worse solution to the problem. We must remain conscious that our support for Ukraine is crucial for the West, but we must not allow for things to get out of hand so that this crisis that generates into the Third World War. And we have to figure out the best ways to be cautious and very, very deliberate in our support of Ukraine. Thank you very much. And I hope you will give this problem a lot of thought.